May 1942, the Pacific Ocean was a vast, terrifying void where the United States was losing. The disaster at Pearl Harbor was still a fresh wound, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, led by the brilliant Admiral Yamamoto, seemed invincible. Yamamoto's plan was simple but lethal. Draw the remaining American carriers into a final decisive battle and wipe them off the map. He chose a tiny coral atoll called Midway as the bait. But Yamamoto had one fatal blind spot. He didn't realize that his secret plans were being whispered in a basement in Hawaii. This basement, known as the Dungeon, was the home of Station HYPO. It was a cold, windowless room filled with the hum of primitive IBM tabulating machines and the frantic scratching of pencils. At the center of it was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man who lived on coffee, cigarettes, and very little sleep, often wearing nothing but a red bathrobe and slippers. Rochefort wasn't a traditional soldier. He was a linguistic genius and a master cryptanalyst. His mission was to break JN-25, the Imperial Japanese Navy's most complex operational code. For weeks, Rochefort's team intercepted thousands of messages. The Japanese were talking about a massive upcoming operation against a target they called AF. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, needed to know what AF was. If it was the west coast of America, the war was over. If it was Hawaii, the stakes were even higher. Rochefort had a hunch it was Midway, but in the world of intelligence, a hunch isn't enough to risk a fleet. To prove his theory, Rochefort devised one of the most brilliant ruses in the history of warfare. He instructed the American naval base on Midway to send a message in the clear, meaning unencrypted, stating that their water distillation plant had broken down and they were running low on fresh water. Then they waited. 2 days later, the trap snapped shut. Station HYPO intercepted a Japanese message that read, "AF is low on fresh water." That was the eureka moment. The mystery was solved. The invisible trap had been turned back on the trappers. Rochefort took the news to Admiral Nimitz. While Washington's top analysts were still skeptical, claiming the target might be the Aleutian Islands, Nimitz trusted Rochefort. He decided to gamble everything. He ordered his 3 precious carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the badly damaged Yorktown, to steam toward a specific point in the middle of the ocean called Point Luck. Because of the Codebreakers, the Americans were no longer reactive, they were predatory. They knew the date of the attack, the direction the Japanese would come from, and exactly how many carriers Yamamoto was bringing. While the Japanese believed they were sailing toward a surprise ambush against a demoralized enemy, they were actually sailing into a meticulously prepared slaughter. The Battle of Midway hadn't even started yet, but in that smoke-filled basement in Hawaii, the war had already been won. Joe Rochefort and his team had stripped away the enemy's greatest weapon, the element of surprise. The invisible trap was set, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was steaming at full speed toward a disaster they never saw coming. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was veiled in a soft gray mist. To Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike force on Earth, the silence of the morning felt like a confirmation of his superiority. He was standing on the bridge of the flagship Akagi, confident that the American fleet was 1,000 miles away, nursing its wounds in Pearl Harbor. But in the next few hours, that confidence would dissolve into a catastrophic fog of war, where every second of indecision would be paid for in blood and fire. The chaos began at 04:30 a.m. Nagumo launched 108 aircraft to strike Midway Island. He held back a second wave of planes armed with lethal oxygen torpedoes just in case an American ship miraculously appeared. This was the standard doctrine, but Nagumo was about to be hit by a series of events that would paralyze his judgment. First, the search planes. To find the Americans, Nagumo launched 7 scout planes, but fate intervened. The scout from the heavy cruiser Tone, designated number 4, suffered a mechanical delay and took off 30 minutes late. Those 30 minutes were the most expensive half-hour in Japanese history. While Tone number 4 sat idle on the catapult, the American fleet was already moving into position, unseen and unheard. By 7 a.m., Nagumo's strike planes returned from Midway with a grim report. The island's defenses were still active. A second strike was needed. This was the moment of the first fatal decision. Nagumo looked at the second wave of planes sitting on his decks, planes armed with torpedoes for ships. He hesitated. If he rearmed them with high-explosive bombs to hit the island, he would be defenseless if an American carrier appeared. But his scouts had reported nothing. Believing the ocean was empty, he gave the order: remove the torpedoes, rearm with bombs. Deep below the flight decks, in the humid, cramped hangars of the Akagi and Kaga, crews worked frantically. Because they were in such a hurry, they didn't follow safety protocols. Instead of returning the torpedoes to the armored magazines, they stacked them against the hangar walls. The ships were now filled with exposed, high-yield explosives and fuel lines, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Then, at 7:28 a.m., the Tone number 4 scout finally radioed in, 10 ships apparently enemy. The bridge of the Akagi went silent. Nagumo was stunned. Panic began to seep through the professional veneer of the staff. Half of his planes were armed with land bombs. The other half were in the middle of being switched back to torpedoes. His flight decks were a chaotic mess of ordnance. At this moment, his tactical genius, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, signaled from the carrier Hiryu, "Launch the attack immediately with whatever we have." But Nagumo hesitated again. He followed the book instead of his gut. He decided to wait, to recover the planes returning from Midway, clear the decks, and then launch a coordinated, perfect strike. He believed he had time. He didn't know that at that very moment, hundreds of American aircraft were already in the air, miles above the water, closing in on his location. The fog of war had blinded Nagumo. He was so focused on the technical perfection of his strike that he ignored the ticking clock of destiny. As the sun rose higher, the Japanese sailors looked up and saw the first white specks of American planes appearing through the clouds. The morning of fatal indecision was over. The 5 minutes of fire were about to begin. Nagumo had waited for the perfect moment, only to realize that in war, perfection is the enemy of survival. By 9:30 a.m. on June 4th, the sky over the Japanese carrier fleet was a chaotic arena of smoke and screaming engines. The fog of war had left Admiral Nagumo's ships vulnerable, but they were far from defenseless. Circling high above the Kido Butai was a lethal umbrella of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the finest dogfighters in the world, flown by veterans of a dozen battles. Into this death trap flew the men of the American torpedo squadrons. They knew their planes were obsolete, they knew their torpedoes rarely worked, and they knew they were flying toward their deaths. The first to arrive was Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. Waldron was a man of fierce conviction. Earlier that morning, he had disagreed with his superior officer about the location of the Japanese fleet. Trusting his gut, he broke formation and led his 15 TBD Devastator bombers on a solo path. When he finally spotted the Japanese carriers on the horizon, he didn't wait for fighter cover. He looked at his men and radioed a final, haunting order. "If only one plane is left, I want that man to go in and get a hit." The Devastator was a slow, lumbering aircraft. To drop a torpedo, it had to fly low, just 50 feet above the waves, and slow down to a crawling 110 miles per hour. This made them sitting ducks. As VT-8 began its long, straight-line approach, the Japanese Zeros swarmed down like hornets. The massacre was systematic. One by one, the Devastators were stitched with 20mm cannon fire. They splashed into the sea, disappearing in plumes of white spray. Out of 15 planes in Waldron's squadron, all 15 were shot down. Out of 30 men, only one survived. Ensign George Gay, who spent the rest of the battle bobbing in the water, watching the destruction of an empire from behind his seat cushion. But the slaughter wasn't over. Next came Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise, and then Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown. They met the same grim fate. The Japanese Zeros were so focused on the easy kills at sea level that they became victims of target fascination. They dove low, chasing the American torpedo planes all the way to the water's edge, exhausting their ammunition and their altitude. To the Japanese lookouts on the carrier bridges, it seemed like a total victory. They had swatted away 3 waves of American attacks without taking a single hit. The American torpedoes that were dropped either missed or failed to explode. Admiral Nagumo and his staff began to relax, believing the Americans were incompetent and their aircraft inferior. But this was the heroic sacrifice that changed history. While the Zeros were busy butchering the torpedo squadrons at sea level, the sky at 20,000 feet had been left completely empty. The Japanese radar, which was primitive, and their visual spotters were all looking down. They were so distracted by the carnage on the waves that they never looked up. At that very moment, 2 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, led by Wade McCluskey and Max Leslie, were approaching from the southwest and northeast. Because the torpedo planes had drawn the Zeros down, there was no one to stop the dive bombers. There was no one to even signal their arrival. The men of the torpedo squadrons had failed to score a hit, but they had performed the most important service of the war. They had pulled the enemy's shield to the ground. They had traded their lives for 5 minutes of clear sky. As the last Devastator vanished beneath the waves, the first American dive bomber tipped its nose over and began its vertical scream toward the Japanese decks. The sacrifice was complete. The door to the heart of the Imperial Navy was wide open, and the 5 minutes of destiny were about to begin. At 10:20 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was at the zenith of its power. On the flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the elite of the Japanese air arm were ready. Engines were turning over, and the air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and the pride of an undefeated empire. Admiral Nagumo believed he had weathered the storm. He had crushed the American torpedo planes, and in just a few minutes he would launch a counterstrike that would sweep the U.S. Navy from the Pacific. But 20,000 feet above him, the 5 minutes of destiny were about to begin. Coming out of the blinding sun were the SBD Dauntless dive bombers of the USS Enterprise and the USS Yorktown. Led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, the Americans had been searching for the Japanese fleet until their fuel needles hovered near empty. By a stroke of pure luck and brilliant intuition, McCluskey had spotted the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing back to the main fleet. He followed it, and what he saw through the clouds was a sight every pilot dreams of. 4 massive Japanese carriers, their decks crowded with planes, fuel hoses, and bombs. There were no Japanese Zeros to meet them. The air cover was still at sea level, finishing off the last of the American torpedo planes. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey gave the order. The dauntless pilots pulled their flaps, tipped their noses over, and entered a near-vertical scream toward the target. First came the Kaga. Nearly 30 bombers dove on her in a terrifying, synchronized line of death. The first few bombs missed, but then the world turned into fire. A 1,000-pound bomb smashed directly into the Kaga's aft bridge, killing almost everyone there. More hits followed, piercing the flight deck and exploding in the hangars. Because the Japanese had left their torpedoes and bombs out in the open, the ship didn't just burn, it detonated. The Kaga became a volcano of twisted steel and human screams. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Richard, or Dick, Best led a small group of 3 bombers toward the flagship Akagi. Best was a marksman. He released his bomb at 2,500 feet. It crashed through the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, right in the middle of the fully fueled B-5N Kate bombers. The explosion severed the ship's fire mains. Within seconds, the pride of the Imperial Navy was a doomed, burning wreck. Admiral Nagumo, stunned and silent, had to be physically dragged from the bridge as smoke filled his lungs. To the north, Max Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown fell upon the Soryu. 3 direct hits turned the carrier into a charnel house in less than 3 minutes. The explosions were so violent that they blew aircraft into the sea and trapped sailors in the engine rooms below. In just 5 minutes, from 10:22 a.m. to 10:27 a.m., the strategic balance of the Pacific War had flipped upside down. The Kido Butai, the force that had terrorized Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean, was gone. 3 carriers were now floating funeral pyres. The Japanese sailors who, minutes before, were cheering for victory, were now jumping into the oil-slicked water to escape the heat. This was the 5-minute miracle. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a cosmic shift. The SBD Dauntless, a plane that many thought was too slow, had delivered a knockout blow to the heart of the Japanese Empire. As the American pilots pulled out of their dives and headed back toward their ships, they looked back to see 3 massive pillars of black smoke rising into the sky. The legend of Japanese invincibility had been burned away, and the road to Tokyo was finally open. By 10:30 a.m. on June 4th, the Pacific Ocean was a scene of apocalyptic destruction. 3 of Japan's elite carriers were burning, but 1 remained untouched by the American dive bombers, the Hiryu. On its bridge stood Rear Admiral Timon Yamaguchi, a man often called the finest tactical mind in the Imperial Navy. He was the last samurai of the Kido Butai. While the other carriers were being consumed by fire, Yamaguchi did not panic. He knew that the only way to save the mission, and perhaps Japan itself, was to strike back immediately with everything he had left. Yamaguchi's counterstrike was swift and ferocious. He launched 2 waves of aircraft toward the last known position of the American fleet. Their target was the USS Yorktown. The Japanese pilots, despite their exhaustion, flew with a desperate vengeance. They found the Yorktown and hammered it with bombs and torpedoes, leaving it dead in the water and listing heavily. For a brief moment, the Japanese believed they had evened the score. But the Yorktown refused to sink easily, and its damage control teams performed miracles, patching the deck so quickly that when the second Japanese wave arrived, they thought they were attacking a completely different, undamaged carrier. However, the American victory at Midway was already written in the stars. While Yamaguchi was preparing a 3rd strike, American scout planes spotted the Hiryu. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now in command of the U.S. task force, launched a final decisive strike of 24 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise. At 5 p.m., the last samurai met his fate. The American pilots, many of whom had already flown multiple missions that day, dove through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. 4 1,000-pound bombs slammed into the Hiryu's forward deck. The explosions were so powerful they blew the elevator platform clear off the ship and into the bridge structure. The Hiryu was now a blazing wreck, just like its sister ships. As the sun set over the horizon, the reality of the defeat finally reached Admiral Yamamoto on his flagship, the Yamato, hundreds of miles away. He had lost the core of his naval strength in a single day. At 02:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the most painful order of his life. The Midway operation is canceled. On the deck of the dying Hiryu, Admiral Yamaguchi made a final traditional choice. He ordered his men to abandon ship, but he refused to leave. He tied himself to the bridge alongside the ship's captain, Kaku Tomeo. As the destroyer Makigumo fired torpedoes into the Hiryu to scuttle it, Yamaguchi and Kaku stayed with their ship, descending into the dark depths of the Pacific. It was a final act of samurai defiance in a war that had moved beyond ancient codes of honor. The Battle of Midway was over. The Japanese had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including their most experienced mechanics and pilots. The Americans had lost the Yorktown and 1 destroyer, but they had gained something far more valuable: the initiative. The tide of the Pacific War had officially turned. The Japanese Empire, which had been expanding rapidly since 1931, had finally hit a wall it could not break. From this moment on, Japan would be on the defensive, retreating island by island back to Tokyo. The turning tide wasn't just a change in naval power. It was the moment the world realized that the industrial and tactical might of the United States was an unstoppable force. The sun was setting on the Japanese Empire, and the long, bloody road to peace had finally begun.